All right. Good morning, everybody. Happy Wednesday. Good morning, everybody. All right. Okay, so first I want to thank everybody for coming. I'm pretty excited to introduce the awesome panel that we have. I think not only do we have an awesome representation of our organizational leaderships, but I think it's a great representation of the strong collaboration and coordination that's been ongoing through the entire time that we've been going through this continuous integration and continuous delivery journey. So welcome to the panel. We're going to be talking about accelerating modern software practices through CI/CD. My name is Rosie Bauer. I am the Deputy Director within ASALT DASA DES. Joining me is Ms. Jennifer Swanson. She is the Deputy Assistant Director of the Army for Data Engineering and Software. Also, Ms. Margaret Boltner, Deputy Assistant Director of the Army for Strategy and Acquisition Reform. Mr. Willie Nelson, he is the Deputy to the Commanding General of Army Futures Command. Mr. Jim Amato, the Executive Technical Director, Deputy to the Commander of U.S. Army Test and Evaluation Command, and Ms. Megan Dake, Deputy Assistant Director of the Army Procurement. Thank you for joining us. So to help kick us off, I want to hand it over to Ms. Swanson to talk about the importance of CI/CD, why it's critical, and some of the obstacles that we are overcoming and what we have to be aware of.
All right, Rosie, thank you. So good morning, everybody. Thank you. Yep, you learned from Rosie. That's good. Okay. So I think the Under said it really, really well yesterday. So I'm gonna start there as far as why this is important. Most all of our systems really are driven by software, and that just continues to evolve and grow, right? I mean, software powers everything. We are getting ready, we have to be ready to fight a near-peer adversary, right? So when they show up on the battlefield with whatever they may bring to the table, we need to be able to very rapidly iterate capabilities out so that we maintain overmatch. We don't know exactly what they'll have, but we know that the way to maintain overmatch is to be able to update the software quickly and iteratively so that we're able to counter whatever it is that they have. Where we are today, we can't do that. We have been following waterfall software practices for a long time, and so we are not postured today to be able to really rapidly push out capability. I'm not going to say that is true across every single system. I think we have pockets of excellence, but by and large, I would tell you we're not there. So the Under talked yesterday about the capability portfolio review process that he led. That was really last year, where he approved the Army embracing industry best practices, which is really continuous integration, continuous deployment, or CI/CD, right? So agile software development and CI/CD is what the Army is, that's our path. That's where we are headed. That does not just happen, though, like magically, because there are a lot of, I would say, industrial age processes that we still follow, had been following, still follow to a great extent, although I think we've made incredible progress in a year. But there's a lot of processes that have to adapt in order to enable us to get there. And so I'm not going to dig into really the details of that because that's what this great panel is going to talk to you about. What I will tell you is that after CPR finished and the Under approved, and we teased out some processes that we knew had to change. So there were things that were pretty much, very clear to everybody that, hey, if we don't adopt this or adopt that, we're not going to be able to get where we want to go. But there were things also that we knew we didn't know. And so part of what the Under approved was 4 Pathfinder programs that we established earlier this year in January. They're already doing what they're doing, so they weren't like new starts or new stand-ups. They were basically programs that were at different points of their life cycle that we could follow to better understand pain points, So there were, like I said, there were things that were very obvious that we had to change, and we started working those quickly with the process owners. There were other things that came out of these Pathfinder efforts that were things like, for example, I'll give you one. Army interoperability certification testing. So that's a process that is owned by the Army G6. It is something that every software program has to go through before fielding. And the process it is conducted out at the Central Technical Support Facility, CTSF, in Fort Hood, Texas, twice a year. So basically, you take your software out there, like literally physically. Everybody goes out there, connects all their stuff up, and you have to pass this thread-based test before you are allowed to field. So guess what? That probably delays you by a year, because by the time, if you have software available in month 1, but you can't go to actually test until month 6, and then the report takes 3 months, and then fielding approval, right? So again, industrial age processes. So that's a really good news story, because we were able to work with the G6 and very, very rapidly adjust that process. So now, and there's already a memo signed out from the G6 that has modified that process. The bottom line is test reciprocity is now being leveraged, meaning if you have other data, like you were able to do integration testing in your lab, you can use that. And basically the PM is now owning and accepting responsibility and risk. So they get to make the decision, do I have enough? Am I well integrated? Am I not? And they have to have the data to prove that to themselves, and they have to inform the G6, but there's many cases now where they don't actually have to get approval, so that we can speed the process up of fielding. And then the other piece of that is we are moving that whole capability to the cloud, which makes sense in today's day and age, not to have it like in an actual place. So that is underway as well. So that's one example. There's many, but I think that's really what you're going to hear about from the rest of the panel today in terms of some of the other processes that need to change. But like I said, it's really a whole Army effort. We absolutely cannot do this alone at ASALT, and we've gotten great support from everybody that's up here and many others to make rapid changes so that we can really quickly adopt CI/CD. So, Rosie, I think that's all I've got.
Thank you, ma'am. So one of the biggest things that you mentioned was that there's changes in processes, right? And those types of changes actually drive policy changes, requirements in policy. Ms. Boldner, can you talk to us a little bit about where we're heading in codifying a lot of these decisions and the policy changes for us?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. So as these two ladies have already pointed out, really, this is going to require a lot of changes in policy and process in order for us to actually adopt these type of modern software development approaches. And I think one thing that I'll foot stomp, and it's been discussed before, is that this is less a technical challenge and more of these kind of foundational challenges, right? So more of we have to change our policies and processes in order to adopt these types of development approaches, but these development approaches are being done in industry, and so that's less the challenge. It's more the how do we fix our system so that we can actually take advantage of these types of things. And so over the last year or so, we have identified a lot of what those systemic obstacles are, if you will. Before I dive into each one of those, kind of at a very high level though, and Jen alluded to this, I think it's important to talk about kind of our current system that we have to operate within right now, provide a little bit of context, and then I'll hit on some of the improvement that we've already made in the last year, which has been pretty significant, and then all of the great work that we are preparing to roll out in the coming kind of weeks and months. And I know that my fellow panelists will dig into several of those areas in particular. So first, for context, right, if you think about our traditional acquisition system, it was not meant to enable the type of agility and flexibility that modern software development requires, right? It was built during the Cold War era. It was built when major powers were building very large, very expensive weapon systems that were meant to last for a very, very long time. And so the policies and processes that underpin that current acquisition system are really built with all of those hardware-intensive systems in mind, hence why we require you to bring physical things, right, to certain test facilities. And so that's why it was built. It was not built with to enable modern software development because, of course, at the time, the type of software and software development that we're doing now was not even contemplated, right? So that was not even an option. Those are the types of things that we're looking at, that foundational kind of traditional acquisition system. What do we need to change there? And I think this is not a new problem, not a new issue that we are looking at. If you go back in time, back to 1980, there have been dozens and dozens of audits and studies and reports that have really called out kind of the Army and broader DoD for not updating our systems so that we can continuously kind of update software with more flexibility and more agility. But I think that my fellow panelists and I certainly feel that in the last 5 years, really, there has been kind of the most significant progress in this area than in the rest of that time period that I just talked about. And I think there's a couple of reasons for why we're so focused on this right now. I think the first, as Jen alluded to, right, more than ever before, it's a national security imperative that we figure out how to rapidly and securely, right, develop and deploy this software, especially when we're talking about things like our pacing threat, right, the People's Republic of China. And so that's the first reason I think that there's an enhanced focus on it right now. The second is congressional support. Over the last several years, they have been very specific to the department, giving us very specific direction and also some very unique authorities that will are allowing us to lean more into this space, and I'll hit on one of those in a minute. And then the last one really is senior Army leadership kind of focus on this area. I think you all heard the Secretary in her opening remarks on Monday talk about how the nature of warfare is changing, and we have to adapt to that if we're going to be successful and if we're going to maintain a competitive advantage. And even at this AUSA, right, if you look at of the 7 CMF panels that were hosted, 1 was entirely focused on digital transformation, which is huge. And of course, we're hosting a number of other kind of venues and forums to talk about these things. And so it really is top of mind for leadership more than ever before. And like we've mentioned, there's already great work underway. I think from my perspective, the most significant leap ahead that we've had already in this area in the last couple of years is the implementation of the software acquisition pathway. And so that's one of the authorities that Congress gave us that I mentioned. They gave us the authority in FY20. We implemented it a year later. And so we've only had it for a couple of years. But I think we're already seeing the benefits of that pathway for us. And really, it's driving us away from the kind of waterfall linear approach into a much more agile approach, allowing us to have more agility and flexibility. And I think it's really doing this through 2 key ways. The first is that it's reducing bureaucracy, plain and simple, right? So it allows us to bypass requirements processes, which can be very time consuming. It allows us to bypass the traditional acquisition system, which can be cumbersome. And it streamlines and eliminates a lot of kind of the documentation that is typically required to even start a program. So that's it, in that way, it's allowing us to be more agile. But it's also forcing us to really align ourselves to industry best practices in a couple of ways as well. So it requires more frequent kind of capability releases. I think it's within the first year and annually thereafter. And obviously, I think we would like to be even faster than that, but that is a start in the right direction. And the second is that it really forces more user involvement than what we've had before. It forces us to work with the users throughout the development of the software so that the software solution actually meets the needs of the users at the end of the day, which is critical. And so we have 11 programs currently executing on that pathway. I think we're seeing a lot of great successes and wins already. But I think that it's also allowing us to see ourselves better and to see those foundational challenges better as these programs are executing on this pathway. They're hitting a number of other barriers in kind of all of these other associated and supporting processes of the acquisition system. And so to that end, over the last year or so, we've really launched a concerted effort to look across all of those processes and figure out where can we reform so that we can adopt these types of development approaches on a much broader scale. And so I think in the coming weeks and months, you will see that the Army will release, kind of a suite of policy changes, software acquisition, software development policy changes that are really intended to make some of these changes and make this a little bit easier for the Army. And I think I'll hit at a very high level what a lot of those processes are, and then I know my panelists will deep dive into several of them. So the first is obviously requirements, right? That's where the acquisition life cycle begins. And I think historically we've written prescriptive, detailed requirements, very, very long documents that are rigid and don't allow for the type of iterative, development of a solution that modern software development requires. And so the AFC team, working with its partners, has really leaned into this and come up with some good solutions to the problem that I know Mr. Nelson will talk about. And so we are getting after the requirement side of the house. On the software acquisition, so the actual kind of development of the software, that's really where the software pathway largely comes in, but we can't stop there. There's certainly other things that we can be doing, other approaches that we can use that, when used in conjunction with that pathway can kind of compound the benefits. And I think the perfect example there is more use of MOSA, right? That will actually enable us to kind of upgrade and change out the software as we need to with more flexibility. Contracting. Another big area, we have to look at the way we're writing our contracts, the types of contracts that we're choosing to make sure that we're not setting up contracts or agreements that are too rigid for what modern software development really requires. And so Meg Dake, the DASA-P team, the whole ACC team, I know have been really looking at this issue for a long time, and they've got some good stuff going there to help us get after the contracting problem. Test and evaluation. Right? Our T&E processes have historically been a little bit rigid, kind of as Jen has alluded to before, requiring people to go in person somewhere, for example, for a software solution. But over the last year, the ATEC team has really been leaning in and figuring out how can we streamline and modernize the way that we do testing for software development. So that's another area that we're looking at. Cybersecurity, right? It's really important to make sure that our software is secure before we put it onto any of our networks. That's obviously very, very important. But our processes right now are manual and they're very time intensive. ATOs, for example, I think a recent GAO study found that can be the most costly and most time consuming step in the process to get software actually deployed is to get that ATO. And so what can we do to streamline and to automate those processes as much as possible, just so that we can be faster, but also so that our cybersecurity can be enhanced? How can we get into more of a continuous monitoring posture as opposed to kind of a static posture that we currently have? And then the last couple of areas, cost estimating, for example. That's one that not everybody thinks about when we're talking about these foundational processes that need to adjust. We really know how to cost estimate for our hardware-intensive systems, but it's a different ballgame when you're talking about our software-intensive systems, especially when you add in the fact that we don't have a ton of historical cost data for our software, our agile software development programs. And so how can we learn from industry? What are the best practices when it comes to cost estimating for these types of efforts? Sustainment, and I know Jen will hit this again a little bit later on in the panel, but what does that look like for software, right? If CI/CD, that's what we're adopting, what does sustainment even look like, right? If it's never really done, if we're constantly iterating and upgrading software, what policies need to change on the sustainment perspective to reflect that? And then lastly really is talent management, because none of the rest of it matters if you don't have the right kind of folks and the right expertise to do that. And so we're looking at our current workforces. How can we upskill our current workforces to make sure that we are digitally literate, if you will, to make sure that we are ready for what's coming. But how do we attract and retain folks? How do we bring in that type of talent? And then how do we keep that type of talent in the force? Because that's going to be absolutely critical moving forward. And so, again, kind of a high level, those are all of the different processes, all of the different piece parts of the acquisition cycle that we are looking at. And I think that it's a very collaborative effort across the Army looking at these issues. And of course, we are keen to partner with industry on this because, as I mentioned, you guys have implemented a lot of these things already. And so I'm excited for us to kind of dive deeper into some of these areas and for the feedback from the industry team.
Thank you, Ms. Boltner. So, Mr. Nelson, as Ms. Boltner said, right, within the acquisition process, everything starts with requirements, right? And I know Army Futures Command has done a lot of things. And so can you talk to us a little bit about what you've accomplished during FY23 and what we expect to see in 24 and beyond?
Sure, and good morning. And I was going to say everything starts with requirements. I appreciate really in some cases policy begins to shape all that even from the very beginning. And then quickly follows again, like you said, the requirements. And like everything else, you're going to see a constant theme through the conversation today of agility and agile and our ability to adapt and go fast. It's not just about speed also, it's about going at the right pace and tempo that as the maturity of the program, and in this case the software matures. And so I think one of the biggest changes you'll see in what we've done from requirements is what we've done from requirements across the board. Initially we started to look at the requirements process, be it hardware, software, whatever, at the very beginning of this years ago, and really embrace the idea and concepts of directed requirements, which get the initial thing in the box, and then you begin to iterate and improve and expand on that with abbreviated CDDs and other types of CDDs as you begin, the maturity of the program improves and your knowledge in terms of the requirements improves. Software is no different. And so especially when you have software-based or in software-intensive types of programs, same thing. So what we've adapted to from a requirement standpoint are essentially ICDs and CNS's capability need statements. And the important thing to understand, much like a DR type of environment, these are 10-page type documents. These are not full-blown, multiple 100-page documents that have aspirations of every requirement known at the very beginning of the life cycle. And so you really start with a 10-ish page document that then is coordinated among the team, and then bring in soldier touch points over the development of that to be able to then fill that out and validate some of those requirements and then build on that in the future. I think from starting with that and then through a DevSecOps environment that we all are pretty accustomed to at this point, really starts to lay in those other layers on the requirement. I think just off the top, for the benefit of the crowd, I think that's probably one of the biggest changes we've seen and probably one of the most impactful changes from a requirement standpoint that I'd offer to you today. We can get into some other details later through the conversation. I'd sure love to have some questions from the team here as well.
Thank you, Mr. Nelson. One of the things with CI/CD, this continuous integration, continuous delivery, is also continuous testing, right? And both Ms. Swanson and Ms. Boldner hit upon the fact that, the way we do tests today, it's archaic, it's manual, it's long. So Mr. Amato, can you talk to us about kind of where ATEC is going and how they're adapting as we go down the CI/CD journey?
Absolutely. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for that question. And so I would say that the fact that the T&E community is even sitting at this table shows you how fundamentally different we are attacking this problem, right? And it is a beautiful thing. I'm very, very excited. I've been doing T&E inside the Army for about 35 years, and from my perspective, we are in the midst of the biggest transformation of test and evaluation since the Army stood up ATEC in the late 1990s. And it's not because ATEC just decided we wanted to do things differently. This is really driven by the entire Army modernization enterprise and how can we best enable getting capabilities to our warfighters. And so how are we going about trying to make ourselves more effective, more efficient, and better partners? And so we've got several initiatives underway that I'm really excited to share with you and can talk more about either at the end or after. We have shifted to a continuous campaign of learning where we are really using all sources of data, whether that data comes from the vendor, whether it comes from our Army S&T labs, experimentation, soldier touch points, or data that comes off of our test ranges and our operational test command. We want to be able to use it all to tell the complete story. And really what this is all about is enables us to develop a tailored test and evaluation strategy that's really focused on what's the decision that's being made, what's the information that the decision maker is going to need to make that decision, and what are all the data that we already know and have available, and then take that gap of data, the information that we still need, and how do we go about getting that? Can we get it through modeling and simulation? Can we get it through a soldier touch point? Or do we need to conduct our own testing to get that? And so this is not about continuous testing from the ATEC perspective. This is about continuous learning and using all sources of data to be able to get after that. We hired a chief data officer about a year and a half ago and we basically told him one thing. We gave him one mission. We want you to digitize the entire ATEC enterprise. Okay, a year and a half into that, we are almost to the cloud. You mentioned the time to get an ATO. I think we're about a month away. Real close. But for the first time ever, we will be able to take all of our test data coming from Aberdeen Test Center, Yuma Proving Ground, White Sands Missile Range, Operational Test Command. It doesn't matter where. It will all be readily available and almost instantaneously accessible to our evaluators so that they can more rapidly sift through all of that data and focus on the analytics and the so what does it mean to the soldier, and not focus on spending hours and hours converting data from multiple formats into a usable form, getting PM's approval to share data between programs, right? And so all of those things that really stand in our way, this cloud solution will enable us to do near real-time analytics. I think it was said we publish reports in about 3 months after the test is done. We're working to get emerging results briefs in under a week. This cloud solution should enable us to turn data and information in hours. And so that does two huge things for us. Number one, I already mentioned, it enables us to share the information much quicker, right? We can tell senior leaders how things are going. We can tell the requirements developers whether or not requirements might need to be adjusted. We can share the information with vendors so that software fixes can be made in real time at the test site, as opposed to waiting a year and coming back a year later. But the second thing it does for us internal to ATEC, at the end of each day, we can look back and make sure that we got the data that we thought we were going to get, right? So did the Blue Force execute the movement to contact that they were supposed to execute? Did the jammers come on when they were supposed to? Did all of our instrumentation work and record for us the data that we have, so that we know at the end of the day, can we move on and the next day do the next mission, or do we need to go back and repeat something so that we can get the valuable data that we need? So our move to the cloud and digitization of our entire enterprise will enable us to do that. In addition to this, next week we are standing up for the first time ever our distributed live virtual constructive test capability. So again, we have linked every one of our test ranges, passing data back and forth. We've linked it with models and simulations. We've linked it with all of the wraparound sims to enable us to demonstrate our ability to conduct a simultaneous event in the live world, virtual, and constructive world, all across every one of our test ranges participating, so we can have a ground vehicle at Aberdeen Test Center with a radio sitting at the electronic proving ground in Fort Huachuca, and we can jam that from Redstone Test Center, and to the system, it all looks like they're co-located, and it's all happening in real time. But we're able to do those effects inside. We're able to do them at scale, and we don't have to go through the 270-day-long process of getting FAA approval to turn on a jammer. Right, and so this capability is really going to enable us to do MDO, multi-domain operation, test and evaluation against a near-peer threat in all domains, including electronic warfare and cyberspace. We've also got, for the first time ever, an ATEC-approved capabilities development document. And what this has done is the Army has now validated our requirements to do three things: generate a realistic operational threat, to do real-time test monitoring control of all the assets moving around the battlefield in the live space as well as in the virtual and constructive, and do all the near real-time data analytics on the back end. And so because we have all those requirements validated, we're now able to fight for adequate POM resourcing in order to meet those requirements. And then the last area that I'll talk about, and you've heard about it a lot over the last couple days, is the upskilling of our workforce. We're on a deliberate campaign to make sure that the ATEC family is postured to support the Army of 2030 and the Army of 2040. If we wait until a capability or a technology shows up on our doorstep and then figure out how to test and evaluate it, we're going to be late to need, and it's going to take too long. So we are leaning forward, working with Army Futures Command and our ASOL partners to figure out how can we make that happen, what's coming, and we're leaning forward to get ready.
Thank you, Mr. Armato. So as we continue to modernize how we develop our software, where the rubber meets the road, and equally important is how to modernize our contracts, right? How do we change our contract strategy? So Ms. Day, can you talk to us on what are we doing? What industry should expect as we modernize our contract strategy?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me. Thanks for that question, Rosie. So I'll start first with kind of the upskilling the workforce, right? So as we recognize, we buy a lot of software in the Army. I don't even know if we recognize how much software we buy because so much is embedded, as Ms. Swanson talked about, in our weapon systems. So really kind of extrapolating the cost of that is difficult because it's embedded in our hardware platforms. And all of that is done through contracting. And so we recognize the contract is really where the agreement with you as the vendor. So contracting is part of that. So the contracting workforce has to understand what we're talking about, software development. So upskilling our workforce. So when Mr. Bang came in as the PDEP to this digital transformation, he recognized it's not just the PMs, the software workforce, it's the entire acquisition workforce. So we've done a lot of work to upskill the entire Army contracting workforce just to understand what this all means. And now we're really looking at more specific contracting types of courses for them in the software field. So that's one thing. And really, to modernize our contracts is kind of getting down back to basics. It's really contract types, providing the flexibility of the contract types. We've used a lot of firm fixed price contracts for software development, not the most flexible contract types. So we're really kind of, as Margaret talked about, some of these things you're going to see, trying to use more flexible contract types. And you probably would never have heard this out of the DASA-P, but cost reimbursable types, time and materials for software development provides more flexibility. But we will hold contractors accountable for that. So you'll see deliverables, procedurals, and we're going to rely on our contracting officers and our cores and our PMs to manage those contracts. But we have leadership support to do that because we need to make sure that they're delivering. And a cost reimbursable contract is just not a cash cow for contractors. But we need to have that flexibility. But to understand how to structure those contracts, to have modular contracting is really, really important. It is important for the contracting workforce as it is for the PMs. So we might use things like firm fixed price or fixed price incentive or cost plus incentive or incentive type contracts as we get down a little bit down this journey. But also having the contracting workforce involved up front in the acquisition planning, understanding what the requirement to best structure the contract. So that's when I say getting really back to basics, because that's just the basics of any good contract, is understanding the requirement and structuring it so it meets your PM's needs. And then source selection. So doing more oral proposals, down selects, multi-phase. Prove that you can actually meet the requirement through instead of just less paper. So those are the types of things that we're going to be looking at. But really holding the contractors accountable. I think in some of the sessions earlier this week, we've talked about procedurals, deliverables. We're going to hold contractors accountable for delivering those softwares. So even if we may be using more T&M and cost reimbursable contracts, we will be holding, it's more work on the government, recognizing that, but this is really, really important. So those are the types of things that you're going to see more out of the Army when we're talking about doing more software contracting.
Thank you, Ms. Stake. If I can stay with you for a few minutes, because I think it's important, right? So you mentioned contracts that are more flexible. So in your perspective, what are some obstacles that we need to be aware of, that we need to address, that might prevent us from getting there? Like in your thoughts, what are those obstacles that you're starting to think about or we need to think about in order to get to that flexibility that you just talked about?
Well, change is hard for anybody, but we're a big Army, right? So it's going to take some time. Our goal is to get to a centralized contracting activity to do software contracting over time, and then really to educate all of our centers to do really good software contracting, because we understand software is embedded in all of our weapon systems and really across all the Army as we go further down. So it's really time is really the impediment. It's just going to take some time. Nothing. And I know we like to move very fast, and sometimes it just takes a little bit more time, because contracts do take a long time, as we see, but we do want to, progress this along. So we're the Army, so we like to move fast, but sometimes it takes a minute. So.
Thank you, ma'am. So, Ms. Boltner, if I can ask you a few questions. Can you talk to us about maybe an example of a policy that you're looking at changing in order that's critical for us to get to a CICD type of construct?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's a couple of examples, some of which have already been mentioned up here by myself or my fellow panelists. I think one that we haven't talked about yet is the material release process. That's a process that all of our systems have to go through, whether they're software or hardware intensive, to make sure that they're complying with all of the requirements. But it's a very long process, and it can be a bit tedious. And so when we're talking about software that needs to move more rapidly, it really is not setting us up for success in that way. And so one of the things that ASALT has done, ASALT owns that material release process, is that we've started a pilot program over the summer to look at how we can streamline those processes on the software side of the house. Do we need to delegate authorities differently? Are there steps in the process that we can simplify and streamline? And so that's one of the things that we're looking at, that we're hoping to make a much more streamlined, kind of condensed process, is that material release process. I think the other big one that comes up time and again is ATO. I think several of us have mentioned that. So the actual process of getting the authority to operate on a network. Again, I think that can take a significant amount of time. Again, that GAO study that I referenced finds that it is often the most costly, most timely step in the process of getting software deployed. And so right now it's a very manual process. We do the checks, we submit it. It waits. Netcom has to do an assessment of it. But if Netcom doesn't get to it in time, then we have to do it all over again because the data is only good for so long. And there are certainly ways to streamline that. We can automate some of those processes, which is one of the things that we're looking at. And we're partnered very closely with the CIO on this, Mr. Leo Garciga. He's the one that really owns this process. But we're working very closely. So can we streamline it? Can we automate parts of that process? Can we look at ATO reciprocity? So once I have an ATO from one organization, shouldn't I just be able to use it across organizations, at least within the Army at first? And potentially we can work with our sister services in OSD to seek reciprocity there as well. That would be incredibly helpful. And the other thing that we're looking at is moving from kind of the traditional ATO process to a continuous ATO process. This is something that OSD has been pushing the entire department to move towards. And so I think Leo Garciga, working with kind of the other stakeholders, we're really looking at how we can move in that direction so that it's not just a static check on cybersecurity, but it's actual kind of continuous monitoring, which again will alleviate some of the burden if we can actually get to that continuous state. The burden of the traditional process, which again is very, very manual. So I think those are two in particular that we are absolutely looking at, but there's several more.
If I could just add to that for a minute, Rosie, not to throw you off. So yeah, everything that Margaret said. So the software material release process is one that actually came out of the Pathfinders because it wasn't one that we really had visibility of necessarily. So, requirements, test, ATO, we knew that going in. Like, those things have to change, and so we've been working those for a while. But the Pathfinders help to illuminate other things that we weren't really thinking of. The one thing that I've been thinking as I'm sitting up here is, so the Pathfinders have been great. What we haven't done that maybe we should have done and should do is ask industry, help us to identify more obstacles, right? So I think we've been talking about this for a while, so this is not new, should not be new to anybody sitting in the room that we're doing this. But if you have issues, concerns, things that you don't see us doing that we need to be doing in order to achieve the end state that we've talked about, You can talk to any of us up here. You can send an email to my office is dasadefs@army.mil. Send a note and we'll be in touch. But I think it's something that you guys may have a different perspective, just like the Pathfinders had perspectives that we didn't necessarily see at headquarters that can help us. So just wanted to put that out there.
Thank you, ma'am. And I do answer the dasadefs@army.mil, so you can send that to me. So, ma'am, you started going down the road of the Pathfinders. Can you talk to us a little bit about what are those Pathfinders and what are some of the beneficial changes that we've seen?
Yeah, absolutely. So they were 4 programs that were already doing software-heavy programs, obviously, at different points in their life cycle that we kind of took under our wing from the standpoint of really observing what they're doing, talking in detail with them about their pain points so that we could identify things like the software material release process, for example. Other interesting things came out of it, though. So I'll touch on one. So Net Warrior is one of the Pathfinders, and Net Warrior is, I think, actually architected pretty well from a modular perspective, but they were experiencing lots of pain when they added any kind of application on top of Net Warrior. They would have to go through all of the stuff we talked about here again. So test, ATO, they had no reciprocity for anything. So that makes it pretty untenable to, add capability quickly. So one of the things that came out of the Pathfinders, and we're still working on the name, so I'm not going to say exactly what the name is because we're changing it with Mr. Bang, but it's basically a digital reference architecture that lays out things that are kind of core and foundational to, and it's not just about Net Warrior. So we're starting with Net Warrior, but it's really extendable to, I would say, any software product that is going to work this way. So what are the core pieces that are there, that are tested, that are ATO, that are verified? And then how do we abstract out data from software, from hardware, from network, right? The MOSA concept that Margaret mentioned earlier, so that when we add apps, we don't have to go through the whole process. We really just have to test the app. And so I think that's been kind of foundational and I think groundbreaking for our future, for Net Warrior, but also for our future products moving forward. It's going to allow them to add capability a lot more quickly, and that's really where we need to be. So I think that was one of the things that came out of the Pathfinders. We didn't go in thinking about that, but as we talked to Net Warrior, that was really one of their big issues, and how they were being driven to approach it wasn't really making a lot of sense. So I think we made a lot of progress there that we can extend to other programs. And then a lot of the stuff that Margaret already talked about. So how do we get to a continuous ATO? That's something that everybody wants and everybody needs, because it is really an incredibly manual, laborious, painful, and long process. So, but our new CIO is fantastic, and he is working very quickly to get us those kinds of authorities. So I actually think with Leo at the helm, I really truly believe we will be there much, much sooner than I would have anticipated, just because I think he's got a lot of experience from the IC community where they were really already moving quickly in that direction. So he can take a lot of that and apply it to the rest of the Army, and that's what he's doing. So I think that's where I'm at.
Thank you, ma'am. So one of the comments, Mr. Nelson, that I have heard, or questions really from our requirements is, and you mentioned it earlier, how we're going to integrate users, right? Can you talk about how that's working? And I know we have some of the Pathfinders, at least one of them, that's actually looking at that on how we make requirements, how we write them more flexible, and then how we have that continuous user feedback.
Sure, and I think that's just a great example, again, of how agile things are becoming. Not to kind of pick on the past, but just to illustrate a point. When we wrote the CPCE Command Post Computing Environment requirement, I believe it was around 600 pages, which just almost sets you back. It's almost unbelievable if you think about that. But I mean, an extraordinarily heavy lift to try to understand the detailed level requirements for a system of that magnitude and to try to conceptually and literally get that down on paper is an enormous undertaking. And as anybody would know, we probably got it pretty close, but you never get it perfect, the first time especially. And the amount of soldier touch points required to try to fully vet and tease out all that to make sure you got it right is enormous. In contrast, then, when you look forward to where we're headed with some of the ICDs, most recently the STE, the Synthetic Terrain Environment, and the One World Terrain ICDs, initial capability documents, again, back in the 10-page category. Get that initial set right, use soldiers through the soldier touch point efforts that we have to help make sure do we get the high-level requirements right, and then again start to, through other capability drops, start to tease out and understand what the downtrace requirements will be. So I think, again, I just thought I'd illustrate that, that's a significant undertaking in both regards. I'm not saying one's easier than the other, but I think it's an incremental and more agile approach to making sure you get it right. And then again, I think one of the things we've learned over the last many years is the integration of soldiers early and often help make that requirement something I like to call soldier-infused requirements. And so we'll certainly get a better product on the back end of that. But it also takes, I think you've heard it from every panelist up here, a more and broader team approach. So not writing requirements in isolation, writing them in cooperation with the PEO, and in this case, PEO STRI. Our folks at Futures and Concept Center that help work these requirements work across not only, in this case, the cross-functional teams, across ATEC, across other folks across the Army that are all stakeholders in this process. So you start with a good team at the end, you're going to get a much better product at the other end of this. And so I think that's some of the key stuff I think we're learning and constantly improving. That is, I mean, if there's a FORSCOM representative in here, they're probably the ones pulling the brunt in the case of a lot of this, because more soldier touch points really good. More soldier touch points, bigger burden on FORSCOM and the folks for those. So we have to be understanding in that regard and understand that they have a job to do as well. So again, it's a delicate balance, but more, I'll say more is better, is clearly where we would like to go. But we have to balance the needs of the Army while we do that.
Thank you. It is a delicate balance. So, it's a huge culture change, right? And so one of the things, and you touched upon it a little bit, Mr. Amato, the culture change that you're driving in ATEC. Can you talk a little bit more about that and dive into kind of some of the examples that we are seeing and expect to see?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think most of the panelists have said it already, and I know I've said it, so I'll be repeating myself. But the keys to success here are the partnerships. The partnerships across the entire Army modernization enterprise, partnerships with industry and academia, and partnerships with other services and our allies, because we know we have to test and evaluate as we fight. And we fight as a joint and as a combined force. So some of the big, the reasons that I say that, specific to ATEC, we don't have enough resources inside of our own formation to own all of the M&S, to develop it, to sustain it, to develop all of the automated test harnesses, the software tools, to develop all the tools that the analytic community can bring to bear, like DAC and TRAC and CAA. And so we need access to the best of breed that's out there. And whether that best of breed is with our industry partner, whether it's with the analytic community, whether it's with Army Futures Command's S&T labs inside of the Combat Capabilities Development Command. But we have got to be able to get access to those digital tools, to those models and those simulations, to enable us to go faster, to enable us to use all of the data so that we can really, really inform this campaign of learning and optimize the testing that we need to do. Not do away with it, but optimize the testing that we need to do. Second thing, we need access to all the data, regardless of the source, right? So again, back to the industry partnerships. We need to have access to the vendor data. We need to have access to the data that's being generated inside the labs, in the M&S, in the analytic community, inside of their physics-based models, inside of their operational war games, inside of their TAA studies that Center for Army Analysis does. We need to be able to pull all that together, again, so that as we optimize this testing, we can leverage to the maximum extent possible all the learning that's already been done, and we can focus our testing on filling the gaps in the information that we know our decision makers need. And then the last thing I would say is, and again, this has been mentioned, the T&E community needs to be brought in at the outset, so we can influence how contracts are written, how we can design these T&E campaigns smartly. I mean, wouldn't it be nirvana for me is if I could do thousands and thousands of reps and sets in the digital space, in the virtual world, and based on that, figure out what are the 2 or 3 conditions that are really, really important, really the most significant, the most challenging to the system under test. That's what we want to go out and do in the dirt. Or where do we have least confidence in our digital tools? Maybe we want to design an event in the dirt to make our tools better. And so if we could get there, that would just be a huge win for our Army and our nation.
Thank you, sir. So I do want to take the opportunity to open it up to the floor for any questions, any comments. You've heard a lot of changes here, and you know, any questions or any comments that the audience has. Okay, hold on. I could only.
Okay, so I'm interested in hearing how are we doing compared to our adversaries in the modernization?
Well, I'm not really sure we know 100%, but what I would say is I think that we need to move quickly, right? So I think it depends which adversaries you're talking about, but I think that China has a very different, I would say, business model that probably allows them to do things in a way that the U.S. can't because we don't operate the way we operate, right? So I think we need to prepare for the worst. Let me put it that way. So I don't know exactly where they are, but I think that we certainly feel a sense of urgency to move as fast as possible so that we can beat them and whoever else we need to come up with.
Yeah, and I think, just quickly, you know, based on what we do know, right, about what they're doing, China in particular is making massive investments in this area, everything from machine learning to AI to more sophisticated software, and that's the stuff that we know about. So we know that they're making very, very significant investments in these areas, and so it's important that we do the same.
And just to add on to that, so why we're trying to modernize we know what industry, how capable industry is, right? Our American industry, the tech industry, how the innovation is out there. We're trying to modernize our business side so we can take advantage of that, right? It's because we know, we're starting to be outpaced by our adversaries, China specifically, because they're making significant investments. So that's why we're trying to modernize the system that we work within. So and we want to hear from industry, right? Because we know that whether you're from industry or the government side, you guys are, you're doing it in the commercial side. So that technology, that innovation is out there. We need to take advantage of that. And we can't just let our business processes and our government bureaucracy, eat us alive, basically. So.
Hello. I have some questions / comments, whichever way you'd like to view them. One is that there's not much emphasis in this discussion on the hardware. And while software is certainly important and an integral part, the hardware is necessary as the interface to the reality. And that needs to be given at least an equal amount of interest. That's just one part. On another area, I am working with RTI, let's say, on a couple of OTA type programs. And the OTAs are not following 10 U.S.C. 4022 or 2371B previously. They're tending to be more of a DFARS type contract, which is not the intent of the law. And what that does is it limits and hinders the ability to have things get done. And I'd be glad to talk with any of you later on about potential ways that I see, as somebody that's been in this industry for many decades, as to how things can be improved. Because I've been through the mill on this now, and I'm having difficulty getting past some of the hoops, you know. I'll stop at that for now, but like I said, I'd be glad to speak with people about this. Thank you.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, go
no,
ahead.
I'm sorry, Margaret. I was just going to address the hardware question, and then I think you and Meg can probably hit the contracting one. So, absolutely, hardware is needed to run software. But what I think where we're heading is hardware is becoming much more of a commodity. Software is really where you're going to be able to iterate the capability quickly, because we cannot stop a war with a near-peer adversary to go upgrade hardware. That's it. We can't do that. And so we have to be able to evolve the capability, AI models, all of those things, leverage the cloud to the maximum possible extent for the compute power that we need, and then have the hardware that we need to run the things that we need to run in the battlefield when needed.
And I'll tell you, again, just to add to the kind of hardware versus software side, and I'll let Meg take the OTA one. You know, we've talked a lot about software reform here today because that's kind of the focus of this panel, but there's been a massive amount of similar reforms done that apply to the hardware side as well. So between, you know, FY16 and FY19, just massive acquisition reform happened. We have all kinds of new authorities like the middle tier pathway, rapid acquisition authority, new contracting vehicles like OTAs, which have been greatly expanded in the last several years that allow us to move much more quickly. All of that can and is applied on the software side, but also importantly on the hardware side, because that's obviously a very important piece of this as well. And so there's lots going on that side as well, just giant reform in the last several years. And so happy to chat with anybody offline specific to those other types of reforms as well.
Sure. And on the comment about the OTs looking more like FAR-based contracts are being treated, obviously in the early days when the OTA authority was expanded and the services were given more authority in that, I think we definitely did see a lot them looking more like FAR-based contracts. You know, we saw deforest clauses in OTs. And if they are still being treated like that, I definitely would like to hear about that. We are trying to get away from that. You know, we've put some Army policy out to try to, you know, because we want to make sure we're maximizing the flexibility of the OTA authority. We do see, I mean, we still have to have certain things addressed in our OTs that we would still also see in FAR-based contracts, because they're being used for some very complex requirements. So, but hopefully we're not seeing FAR clauses just cut and paste in our OTs. That should not be happening anymore. So, but happy to talk to you after this if you'd like.
So I have a two-part question. We talked a lot about ATOs and software being built inside the Army, for the Army, even software as a weapon system and those types of concepts. But I don't know that we've talked a lot about, and it seems to be more prevalent, a lot about the software that's being built for the Army outside of the Army that needs to integrate with the Army. So things like digital engineering environments at OEMs or other things that are actually a part of contracted efforts that have requirements around them but don't necessarily need ATOs or aren't being specified to be within the Army network directly. And so the first part of the question is are there DevSecOps playbooks being set up for those things? And if so, where can we find them? Because I need one. And then secondly, to the contracting side of that, so you have this extremely complex weapon system contract. You know, there's several of them out there that are currently being worked on, and then there are sort of these referenced software pieces that really need to move more agile than, say, the broader weapon system. But they're kind of all being managed together. And is there a way to work together with our PEOs for those larger contract efforts to break out those pieces so that we can be more agile and develop them? Because a lot of them, the requirements are, you know, still in progress and need to iterate much more quickly. And the more complex weapon system just does not, like that procurement process does not allow for that level of flexibility.
Yeah. So the DevSecOps playbooks, yes, they do exist. We've been developing them out of my office and many similar other types of playbooks in the CI/CD realm for the last year. We have an internal site right now where they are posted. Are you government or industry? We can share them. So we are working on an external site, which should be ready soon, but it's not up yet. So if you send a note to dasades@army.mil, we can share what we have. And like I said, we're trying to get something where we can share it more broadly with folks because they're not a secret. I think we want you to know what we are, recommending to our PMs that they do as well. So yeah, we can definitely share that.
And then I think on the second part of your question about kind of the hardware pieces versus the software pieces and needing to move the software a little bit faster when you're talking about a very complex weapon system. One of the things that we are allowed to do now by Congress is to use multiple pathways for one program. And we have that. So I think IAMD is a good example. They have been traditionally operating kind of on our standard pathway. What they did in recent years was pull all of the software pieces out, and those are now operating on the software pathway so that the software can be much more agile than this side of the house, which is really what's required here. And I think what you'll see in some of the upcoming policy changes that we're doing is that we are trying to push that type of approach to the maximum extent where it makes sense, right? It won't make sense in every case, but where it does, it should absolutely be used. Part of the problem is we only maybe have one or two programs, one that has maybe done it, a few that are contemplating it. So, it's a little bit, you have to be a pathfinder and figure out how do you do this? And the concern is, oh my God, do I have to comply with requirements for two pathways there? And what does that look like? So it's part of that culture change, but it's a very value added flexibility that will help, while this is chugging along over here, the software can operate more rapidly. And so that's something that we're absolutely encouraging moving forward.
Yeah, and I would say in the T&E space, we don't have it all figured out yet. So that's one of the reasons that we're participating in on the Pathfinders, right? We know we don't want to develop software and then call timeout and then go do a separate test on it. We need to be able to test in stride, right? How do we do that? Do we bring our test tools into the DevSecOps environment and embed our testers? Do we just embed our evaluators and rely on industry to do the testing for us? Do we just ask for the data or some hybrid, all of the above, right? And so we are working with the acquisition community to really figure out in these Pathfinders what are the different ways that we've got that we can get after the learning that's required, and then figure out what's the best of breed. And it's probably not going to be a one-size-fits-all. There's probably going to be some cases where we're going to do A, other cases where we want to do B. But yeah, so we don't have all the answers yet in the T&E world.
Hi. My question is around how do we use contracts to improve software security and accelerate the ATO process? So GAO audit, most costly, time-consuming aspect, no surprise to anybody. There was talk about move to time and materials and cost plus, which I think can be a slippery slope when it comes to remediating software vulnerabilities up front. The intriguing part was firm fixed price and incentives paired with that. So I'm curious, what are some ideas you have around incentivizing improving software security to accelerate the ATO process and using incentives to do that?
So that's a really good, whether it's cost plus incentive or fixed price incentive, that's a really good example of where an incentive could be, where you're incentivizing that process for that. I don't know if you want to comment on the actual process itself from the security perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
Contract type would definitely be a good example.
So we clearly are very interested in cybersecurity. ATOs and vulnerabilities are not necessarily always 100% linked or aligned, but what's important is that as we get the deliverable software capability, that it is secure and that there is a way for us to be able to ensure it remains secure. So we can definitely look at some ways to incentivize that, as well as probably some CI/CD type of metrics, right? Like capacity, velocity, quality. So I think a big part of the reason why Meg said that we're trying to get away from firm fixed price, even with incentives, is because it's hard for us to, number one, firm fixed price something that we don't exactly know what the outcome is going to be, because software is never done. And so as requirements, as we work with Willie's team to evolve those requirements in sprints, you can't really put that in a contract, because we don't know. We're going to end up buying capability, right? But not, or capacity rather, but not necessarily a specific outcome. And so I think that's what makes firm fixed price hard, but I think incentives can go as part of any type of contract vehicle, and so certainly security would be one of them. I do want to mention, and we do have an RFI out there that I think closes this week, asking industry what you think about SBOMs and the Army requiring SBOMs, and if not that, then what? Because that's really what will allow us to maintain the software security over time, because it becomes impossible for us to know without being able to understand the provenance of the software and what the ingredients are, who's got what when a vulnerability comes down. So if you think back to Log4j, super fun time for many of us, it took months to remediate that across the department, probably longer than that, because it was very insidious and nobody really knew exactly who was using that library, that particular library. And so that's what an SBOM would solve. So I think that has to be part of the story, because otherwise I don't know how we do it. So definitely please take a look at that RFI if you guys haven't seen it.
Yeah, and just going back to the appropriate contract type, it's about managing risk. And I think firm fixed price was a little unfair to industry, and a little bit we found that we weren't really getting what we were signing up for. So it was unfair, in some cases maybe we can firm fixed price something, right? But so whether it's cost plus incentive fee, cost plus fixed fee, time and materials, we will look at every, nothing's really off the table. So it's really about managing the risk of the project. But, cybersecurity and ATOs, that's really, it's all about risk, right? So, okay, good question though.
Is it working? Okay. Yeah, so there's a lot of different kinds of, software. And to the gentleman's point here about the hardware piece, you can software defined something is different than like an application software doing a different function. And those are going to have different business models. They're going to have different development cycles. They're going to have different requirements. And software defined seems to fall a little bit more into like the traditional defense contracting. But when you talk about software, other software areas, or maybe even the software defined, the software industry commercially is moving really fast. And so my question to you guys as we talk about contracting mechanisms and ways to really speed things up for the development inside the Army, how are you guys looking at, or what's your appetite for also saying, we're interested in expanding to, kind of the non-traditional companies that might have been serving defense, so that we can get faster, acquisition, possibly better cost, I would imagine. I don't know.
Hey, Meg, can I start?
Oh, sure.
We're interested.
Yeah, definitely.
So, I think we've been messaging that pretty clearly for the last year. We absolutely are interested in expanding out to commercial software companies, because to your point, I think that's where these types of things that we're talking about today are, very, very much accepted and implemented on the commercial side. In the defense sector, it's spotty, right? And that's partially our fault, because we haven't incentivized software. So we have been talking about hardware for years and years and years, but we have not really talked about software. And so that, I think we bear some of the responsibility for that not being a priority, but it doesn't happen overnight either. It takes some time to be able to build up that expertise. So we are absolutely interested. We certainly are working with the contracting community to figure out what those options are. That's why we're not saying strictly cost plus, because that's going to leave some folks out that we want certainly to have opportunities to bid on work.
Right. Well, and we also, even if it, we have the OT authority, which we can get to non-traditionals, if it's the right authority, right? We're not ruling out OTs. We've used OTs a lot. I think we've probably overused them sometimes for software development in some cases. So FAR-based OTs, Some cases we can get to non-traditionals in that case, if it's especially early on where we're doing some development, and then it moves into more of a production environment. So, but that's a great question, because that's exactly, not that we want to rule out all of our traditional defense contractors too, because they've got a lot of great expertise and innovation too. But we do want to get to some of those, companies that don't normally look at SAM.gov for our RFIs and RFPs that we're getting out there. So we want to hear from those types of companies, and if you're one of them, we want to hear from you. So we're also looking at better ways to communicate with industry, not just on SAM.gov. That's why I think the consortium model has been so successful, because it's really got that reach out to all these different companies through the OT process. So really good question.
Thank you. You had mentioned some alterations to the RFP evaluation processes, like down selects and orals. Does the Army have any appetite for things like code challenges?
What was that?
Does the Army have any appetite for anything like code challenges as part of the RFP process?
Yeah,
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
I think
you guys have done that yet, but yeah, definitely. Yeah.
I think that's a very interesting thought.
Demonstrate it as you go.
Yeah. Well, are you saying kind of like a runoff between the bidders on who can develop things the fastest, best, whatever the criteria is? Yeah.
It's no, it's
right.
Literally, it's
right.
show. It's you actually demonstrate it right there.
Yeah.
It's like an oral, but you're actually demonstrating that you can actually do the code right there.
Actually, I think that's a great idea. I will tell you, I think maybe we're kind of starting to do that, even though we're not calling it that, because if you look at, for example, the EBSC solicitation that's out there, Enterprise Business Systems Convergence, one of the things that we put in there was, so we're evaluating not just the product, but also the ability of the company to be agile, and we're doing that by basically changing the requirements as part of the demo. And then what can you do, right? Show us what you can do. So that is not, coding challenge, maybe not exactly, but I think we're moving in that direction. I think that's a great idea.
Yeah.
If I understand your question, I think the AI community's been doing that for a little while as well. And some of their algorithm development, I think under Project Maven, and some, I think, articulated how you can use some really creative mini competitions to help.
They call it something different, but
they
it's
do,
literally
but
prove it in a source selection. It's like a, I forget what they actually term that they use. So it's like a product demo. Yeah.
To that point, actually, the Navy's software factory, one of them, the Forge, did that. We got down selected for that. They gave sample problems. Yeah. And so you basically, you actually did the sample problems to show that you could actually do a CI/CD problem and put out the code to the requirements in a certain amount of time. So a couple things on the test and evaluation front. Looking at, I got up on that, so I was thinking. What I will say, just from a material release, with Agile, you run sprints and you do demos and you're showing the capability as you're going along. I think that there's a way that you could do the material release process very similar to that. And I think I was going back to the test and evaluation, because when I was in government, I was overseeing some software programs, and of course, old software with Waterfall, you had this big monolithic code, and if you made changes to it, you had to go back and do regression testing of the entire thing, because you would invariably screw something up, and so you had to go do all that revalidation. Now we have containerization and all these other methodologies where you're just putting in an API for a new app, and like you were mentioning before, you can have the base code and core components that are already validated, and now you're just revalidating those other pieces. And oh, by the way, now we've got artificial intelligence and machine learning and those things, and sometimes you've got reinforcement learning, and you've got neural networks, and it's changing, and so how are you testing the things that are changing on the fly as they're learning with new data coming in? But there's a lot of, obviously ways to do that. But I just think that as you're using an agile process for doing product demos as you're going along at the end of each sprint, that you can be doing an incremental material release as you're going along as well, so you're not having to wait and get these big gigantic point releases, if you will, to do that. So I think that there's ways to help all those things.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is really what we're looking at with this pilot. So, I think the material release process, again, everything was tied to how we do hardware. And so it was incredibly onerous for software where it didn't really make sense. So yeah, you're absolutely right. There should be a automatic release at the end of really your sprint, right? Going through, or your PI or whatever, as you hit that final point on your pipeline, that you have all of the things that you need in place to be able to just deliver.
Yeah,
Yep.
and Jen, if I could just add, so yeah, and you're spot on, and the advent of software systems and software-intensive weapon systems offers us a whole new set of opportunities, right? To get after, the hardware question from before, 40 years ago, we had to nail it because we were going to be living with a system that we fielded for a long time, right? Now we've got the flexibility to, when we test and evaluate something, we've got to get the hardware right. And when I talk hardware, I'm not talking about a phone that just can host an operating system that you can throw away and replace. I'm talking about a mobile protective firepower, a precision strike missile, right? The hardware we've got to get right. But when we test and evaluate it, if something's not working the way that we want it, if the issue is software, we know we've got opportunities to fix it. So we can start fielding capabilities incrementally that are good enough, that provide capabilities to our warfighter, because we know that we can just spin the next software development, spin in those fixes, and continually evolve that system over time. So the integration of the hardware and software is really, really important when you get to those complex weapon systems. We got to get the hardware right, because those decisions we're going to live with for a while, and the software we just incrementally improve over time.
Hi, I'm Larry Thomas with NTT Data. I've heard along the way here the interest in the Army, and I'm a retired Army, so I really appreciate that, the interest in digital transformation and the devolution of data, and the fact that industry is ahead of the Army in this. Yet what we tend to see in industry is when the acquisition comes out, there's still a heavy push towards past performance that's Army DoD base. And when we talk to customers, the receiver side, they are welcoming of industry's past performance. Yet when the contract comes out, it heavily weighs federal or DoD experience. And when I've taken that discussion to a contracting officer on a particular deal, I was told, well, you could still submit it, it would just be neutral. Well, that's not helpful when I'm competing.
Really do anything.
So I'm wondering what's being done to push not just the top level, senior level acceptance of that, but push that down through the force. Because I've been with the Army when we've done change before, and I know sometimes the top gets it, the guys down here get it, but that little layer in the middle, it's looking at more work for their desk and they don't want it. So thank you.
So I'll take that and then happy to share. So valid point. So and on this topic, actually on software modernization on contracting. So definitely change is hard, right? But this is part of our upskilling piece. When we're talking about software, we are open to commercial experience. Absolutely. We want that. So we will force it. And that's going to be part of our upskilling of our contracting workforce that's going to be doing this type of contracting. That we don't want just neutral. We want, if you don't have any experience, it's not going to hold. Those are the CPARS rules, right? Past performance rules. But if you do have the commercial experience, government, commercial, that's fair game. We want it. So we've got to. So my contracting leadership across the Army Contracting Command, which is going to be supporting they support our weapon systems, our POs. That's my leadership. It's going to be forced down. That's part of the upskilling. So as we move towards our centralized buying command to do most of the software development, and that'll be promulgated across the centers. When I say the centers that support the POs that are doing the weapon systems that are primarily the weapon systems that are focused on heavy with the software platforms. They will be the most upskilled. And we're going to continue this, right? Because we're always getting new contracting folks. We're always getting new acquisition folks. So we're going to have to continuously upskill those folks. So we will emphasize that it's just part of that we want commercial experience. As in addition to, as the rest of the federal government continues their digital transformation, more industry partners will get more experience too. But it's a valid point because we see that a lot across other, not just software development, that it's, you say it, you preach it, you talk to your PM, your commands, and then it shows up in an RFP. It's got to be government or DoD only. So,
and I think that's something that we can take a look at as we, get ready to release kind of this
Rollout.
set of policy initiatives. We can certainly include that in there kind of as a high level guidance. And then to Meg's point, it's really going to be in the training of the workforce to make sure that the culture change, that we're adjusting the way that we think about these things. But that's a great point. Absolutely.
Well, and policy too, because contract policy is centralized out of headquarters DA, out of my office, down to the contracting workforce. So.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, like Meg was talking about, there's going to be kind of a central group that is really going to be focused on this, and I think that they're starting to talk with industry a lot about this type of stuff to get that kind of feedback. So I will say we probably are not going to get it 100% right, but just like software is never done, this change is never done. So I think we need that kind of feedback as we evolve this so that, you guys can tell us, hey, this is really not working and we need to adapt it.
Okay, we have time for 1 to 2 more questions.
Thank you. My name is Abizer Tebji. I work for Shipcom AI, and we deliver 90-day sprints. We are doing about 20 use cases in the Air Force on AI right now. Since it's a Silicon Valley company, in these 90-day sprints, we tend to get data because we work across all the MatchComs, and we are on contract on Cyber 3. So we are able to deliver use cases in 90 days. One of the things we are finding is that even during the demo, we are able to go ahead and actually deliver the use case, but then the user, the PEO user or the chief engineer tends to trust the integrator, obviously, and then they need to validate it, and they take 3 months just to validate what we do. So it's just a practical issue. I wanted to give you feedback that actually they could be using it as opposed to going through the validation. So that's just a little FYI on our side. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's a culture thing. So, I think change is hard. Meg said it. So I think this is not going to happen overnight as far as everybody, being able to trust the results. I think for AI specifically, if you were at the Unders Digital Transformation panel yesterday, we talked a little bit about how to assess risk of models depending on where they're going to be used, what they're going to be used for. So in some cases, we probably do need more testing, but not in all cases. And so I think it's kind of being able to assess what risk can we accept where.
Well, and to kind of footstop on what Jim was talking about, when ATEC's moving forward to this digital environment to be able to do distributed testing, we're trying to do that on the developmental side as well. And if you can get the new code running quicker in a distributed fashion, you can start learning and the system can start working faster. Instead of having to wait till you can get the entire system and team put together, deploy to the desert or a test proving ground, be able to test that one time, right? We can begin to get that wheel in motion where we're in a constant state of testing and validation versus waiting for a singular moment. And I think that's really the ostensibly what's behind the digital engineering push. But again, it's pervasive. It works into how we test. It works into how we develop, and then even how we certify systems. So the better we get at that, the better we'll be able to more quickly integrate what you're talking about. But you do highlight a good point.
Yeah, Willie, you're absolutely correct. And I think, Jen, I liked your comment on risk, right? We need to, this is not a one size fits all again, right? So having an AI algorithm that can prioritize targets on the battlefield is probably a little more important than making sure my paycheck is correct, right? And so we can probably tolerate a little bit more risk in some of our business systems than we can in some of the warfighter systems where our soldiers' lives are dependent on it. And we just need to be mindful of that.
Yeah.
We have time for one more question. Okay, so I do want to thank you because I think we can all agree, one of the most important things is we do want to hear from you, right? That theme that I think throughout the whole 3 days and the fact that Ms. Swanson said there's RFIs is transparency. So we appreciate your questions. We do want to hear from you. We appreciate your feedback. So as mentioned before, we do have an email at dasadesk@army.mil. We are launching a public website. So we will make sure that everybody knows that, and you're going to see that's a good avenue for us to share things like the playbooks that was mentioned. But please send if you didn't get to your question or if you think about it later, send it to that email dash@army.mil. We do answer you, and so we'll make sure your answers gets questioned. So before we close it out, if each of you can spend a minute on closing remarks. I love the nirvana thought. So as you give your closing remarks, what is your idea of nirvana from each of you? Ms. Swanson?
Oh my. So, I mean, nirvana for me, realistic nirvana, because I don't really operate in the nirvana world because that's not where we live, but I think, being able to quicker, I guess, be more rapid about the change in culture that is needed. I think we have all of the leadership support that we need and then some, and that's really what has helped us to be able to identify these issues, get them fixed quickly. So I think that is working super well. But somebody said earlier about, the workforce, right? And I think, again, they need help to be able to understand why this is important. We're a very big Army, if you look across, and so that's something that just takes time. So figuring out how we can do that faster, I think, is really how we are able to iterate this a lot faster. So that would be my nirvana, Rosie.
Well, that was what I was going to say as well. Really, I mean, I think we've talked about it a lot. The culture change is the hardest thing here, and there's a couple of things that are required for that, right? The policies and the processes, which I think, as we've hopefully made clear today, we're well underway there. I do think in the coming weeks and months, you're going to see a lot of new policies rolling out that'll push us in that direction. I think the second thing for culture change is emphasis from leadership, which we have right now across the Capitol Hill, across the Department of Defense, across the Army. I mean, I think it's evidenced by the conversations at AUSA. It's evidenced by the fact that we have so many organizations sitting up here today talking about this and working very closely together to get this done, because no one organization owns all of it. So I think we need to maintain that type of leadership emphasis on that, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. And then I think the last thing is incentives that we have to focus on. We can't penalize programs that are going to take risks to do some of these things, which has historically happened when some of our programs have tried new and creative things. So I think we have to be really mindful that as we start doing this, as our 11 programs that are on the pathway start executing, as we have programs that say, hey, I want to split apart my hardware and software and work on 2 pathways, that we are incentivizing and supporting that type of behavior and not penalizing it if and when, we hit some bumps in the road. And so, those to me are the 3 main things you need for a culture change. I think nirvana would be if we can make sure that we can help make sure that those are all straight so that we can accelerate that culture change.
I didn't know you could have 3 nirvanas. No, I think that's great. I'm trying to think how I could probably provide you a little bit different context, because I agree with what you both said. I want to turn this into the digital engineering conversation that y'all had, I think, yesterday. But from a requirement standpoint, which is why I'm here today, I think trying to get as fully digital as we can to the point where requirements become fully digital, I think is a step towards nirvana. I think, and then you can pull that thread all the way through the design life cycle through test. With industry, you're probably wondering, you're already there in many cases. How do we embrace that? How do we start to evolve that way? If we fix pieces of this and then we got to go print 600 pieces of paper for the next step of the process, I'm not sure we've fully succeeded, but we are moving that needle. So I think that's an area, and then underpinned by that, and I think we're touching on it, but I'll just say it outright, is, we talk about the delivery of Army of 2030, the design of Army 2040, but at the end of the day, it all starts with people. And so the way we can educate, make sure the education and training dollars are allocated to upskill our talent, the people need to be there today to deliver the Army of 2030 and 40. So I just think the more prioritization, the more upskilling, and the more training and education we can provide across the spectrum to our folks in government to work with industry, I think would be where I would want to put some priority.
Nirvana Part 2.
Yeah, so nothing new from me here. Unfortunately, all the great stuff's been said. But I would just say, it would be so cool if we could take a handful of programs and just carte blanche, set aside all the policies, laws, and regulations, get the smart people in a room to include industry and the Army partners and say, if we were unconstrained, how fast could we go? And what would we want to do? And then just make it happen, right? And then I think we could demonstrate the success and really have some hard-hitting facts to show just how much we're being handcuffed by some of the industrial age processes that we're all operating under.
Okay, my nirvana would be the Congress passes the budget on time, so we have a lot less work on the acquisition workforce, specifically the contracting workforce, because you would not believe the amount of work that CRs has on the so they could actually get to work to actually support their PMs, their POs, their commands, to actually do the work to support and to get to your work as industry. That's really my nirvana. Sorry, it doesn't really have anything to do with this panel.
No, but it's really important.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it is probably nirvana.
So thank you to each of you for your participation. If we can give them a round of applause. Thank you so much. And thank you to you. Now, I know you guys want to leave, but the excitement continues. We do have PEO Lightning Talk coming up, and I think we're starting with T3T. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day.